Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome. My name is Karen Grunberg. I oversee Israel Studies here at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at UT. And I'm just going to, I wanted to say a brief word before we get into the introductions of our guests today. Israel Studies is small but vibrant at UT, and hopefully you've been noticing some of our exciting events. And I just wanted to use this opportunity to plug an event we have. We're bringing a wonderful Israeli artist to campus in March, and she will be talking about her art, and it deals with sexuality, and she's a transgender artist, and it's going to be very exciting. So we hope to see some of you there in March. Just for the details, you can look at the webpage because I don't remember them offhand, but everything is there. So I would like to introduce Jason Lustig. Dr. Lustig is our Israel Institute Fellow here at UT. He's housed in the History Department, and he is behind the wonderful event that we have in store for you today, and he will introduce our speakers.
All right, thanks very much, Karen. All right. Thank you all for coming this morning for what should be a really fantastic and really interesting event. We are joined today by two really important leading scholars in terms of the history of Israel and Palestine, and broadly speaking, in terms of modern Middle Eastern history. We have Laura Robson joining us, who's a professor of history at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, where her research focuses on the local, regional, and global iterations of internationalism and international governance. Her most recent book was States of Separation: Transfer, Partition, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, which appeared in 2017. And that book explored the history of forced migration, population exchanges, and refugee resettlement in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine during the interwar period. And Laura also edited alongside Arie the book Partitions, which we're going to talk about today. And of course, we're also joined by Arie Dubnov, who is the Max Temkin Chair of Israel Studies at George Washington University. Arie's history of 20th century Jewish and Israeli history, with an emphasis on the history of political thought, the study of nationalism, and decolonization. His other books include an intellectual biography of Isaiah Berlin and an edited volume on Zionism, A View from the Outside, which he published in Hebrew, and tries to put Zionist history into a larger comparative trajectory. And I think that in a lot of ways, that is what draws their work together in this Partitions book, titled Partitions, A Transnational History of 20th Century Territorial Separatism, which we're really excited to have them talk about today, which is bringing together the histories of partition in Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, and also in Ireland. And so thank you both for coming all this way to speak about this project and about this broad set of issues. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say into the discussion. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks to Jason for inviting us and the Center for hosting. We're both really delighted to be here and to have the chance to talk with all of you about this project. And as is appropriate for a book about partition, we will be dividing up our talking time. So I will begin with a kind of introduction to the project and talking a little bit about what prompted it and what some of the kind of big issues are. And then Arie will take over and talk about some of the kind of frameworks. So we started this project at a moment when partition seemed to be reappearing as a kind of strategy of diplomacy, a strategy of internationalism. And really, over the past 20 years, the idea of partition as a kind of solution to various iterations of communal strife has suddenly reemerged as a fashionable technique of what is now often called conflict resolution. And what this has really meant is the physical separation of ethnic and religious communities, not just through the redrawing of borders, which is actually often not particularly central to such proposals, but rather through the forced removal and resettlement of populations with the purpose of creating more ethnically homogeneous spaces. And this is an idea that has reappeared over and over again across the past century. It's been proposed for all sorts of extremely disparate situations of conflict, from Yugoslavia to Palestine to Sudan to Syria. And I think there's a tendency, which is regrettable but perhaps understandable, to think about solutions like this as somehow natural. As if, if ethnic or religious or national communities can't get along, perhaps it's better just to separate them, as you might sparring 5-year-olds. And we should clarify here that partition, as we're talking about it in its modern sense, does not in fact mean just a redivision or a new allocation of territory, but rather it means the external devolution of political authority onto local populations who are now being newly redefined as national. And so this is what differentiates these many earlier iterations of division of territory from above, for administrative purposes, from the modern partitions of the 20th and 21st centuries, that is places like Ireland, India, Korea, and recently Sudan. So in fact, we have a situation where people understand partition as actually being for the purpose of solving conflict, right? This is how people understand partition in its modern sense. And we can see this in some of the academic definitions of the phenomenon. For instance, the political scientist Brandon O'Leary, who distinguishes partition from other related phenomena like secession and decolonization by specifying intent, this particular intent. He says, quote, "The ostensible purpose of a political partition, its formal justification, is that it will regulate, reduce, or resolve a national, ethnic, or communal conflict." Which is something that as historians we know partition has never, literally never, actually done. So in thinking about all of this kind of contemporary reemergence of this idea, what we wanted to do in this book was to look at this peculiar idea of partition, of the idea of the physical separation of populations, to think about it historically. How did people come up with this idea, and when, and why? And the book that we've come up with points to two kind of big conclusions. First of all, it argues that we need to understand how essentially modern both these conflicts and this solution are. Both partitions and the problems that they purported to solve are essentially 20th century phenomena. Second, it revealed something more specific, and that is how very deeply embedded the idea of partition is in the politics of 20th century empire, and particularly decolonization. So, in this book, we are trying to convince you that the idea of partition as a kind of conflict resolution is nonsense, that partition is anything but a natural solution to a long-standing and apparently intractable problem, and that in fact it is traceable to a very particular historical moment and explicable within the specific historical framework of British imperial collapse. And that when people promote it, they do so for their own particular political reasons and not because there has ever been any evidence that partition serves as a solution to anything. So this book goes back to the kind of three, what we're arguing are the three kind of paradigmatic examples of partition, which were all undertaken in the 20th century, all under the umbrella of the British Empire. Ireland, 1922, India, 1947, and Palestine, first proposed in 1937 and then sort of partially enacted in 1947-48. And the book seeks to think about how this idea came to be seen as a kind of solution to a newly identified problem, the problems that arise from decolonization itself, and then how it was exported elsewhere as a kind of panacea for the sorts of imperial problems facing the British Empire arising from the process of decolonization. And crucially, finally, it also seeks to understand why partition has retained its appeal in the international realm, even though, as we can see from these three examples here, it has invariably been associated with mass violence of the most dramatic kind. So this is actually not a topic that many historians have approached. And in fact, historians have kind of a checkered history when it comes to dealing with the question of partition. For a lot of the 20th century, nationalist histories shied away from dealing with it at all. They passed over often partition as a kind of, the brutalities of partition as a kind of price of liberation. So that's how we get a generation that thought of partition as something imposed from above by well-meaning but naive imperial servants. This is an idea that plays out in the Peter Sellers vehicle Carlton Brown of the FO and was sardonically parodied in Auden's brutal poem Partition, which I'm sure many of you know, two people fanatically at odds with their different diets and incompatible gods. But then, of course, as the British Empire continued its slow collapse, it became clear to anyone who cared to see it that, in fact, partition had in no sense represented a solution to the problems of Ireland or of Palestine or of India. As the 20th century progressed, as decolonization continued, violence worsened in Ireland, Indira Gandhi was assassinated in India, as the Oslo Accords carved Palestine-Israel up into ever smaller enclaves to the adulation of the Nobel Prize Committee and the dismay of Palestinians on the ground. And as this idea was taken up in other contexts, despite its record of total failure as a mode of peacekeeping, for instance, in the Dayton Accords signed in 1995, which essentially reified and formalized the ethnic cleansing that had taken place during the war. As all of these things happened, as we started to see the longer trajectories, historians started to rethink partition. And this time, mostly we should say led by South Asianists, they focused on its methods: the destruction of communities, the murders, rapes, and dispossessions of millions, the permanent plundering of landscapes, the violent production of uncrossable borders. And this kind of history from below gave us a new and more telling view of the real costs and the consequences of the partition idea, while ironically it was accompanied by an ever clearer commitment to the idea of partition on the part of politicians, pundits, and the chattering classes, who I think by this point had fully internalized the idea that the physical separation of communities could constitute a political solution, as we can see from the ongoing discussion of partitioning Syria and Iraq, for instance, as well as the conversation around Donald Trump's apparent repudiation of the so-called two-state solution in 2017, followed, of course, now by his so-called peace plan. So we do have a historiographical development here, right? But this history from below, as important as it was, still didn't tell us where this idea came from, how partition came to be one of the most fundamental building blocks of the 20th century political landscape, or why it retained its appeal despite all its disastrous failures. So that's also what this book is trying to do, to trace the idea and to understand its resonance against all the odds and against all the evidence. So, having laid out the problem here, let me give you just a taste of some of the answers that we are proposing. Here's another. We are arguing that this is a story that begins with the First World War. In 1919, the architects of the peace agreements who came together at Versailles faced a fundamental problem, which was that they had spent the last 4 years fighting a war that was essentially in defense of a more or less permanent European imperial expansion, but whose trajectory had kind of inadvertently led to a considerable strengthening of anti-imperialism across the globe. And anti-imperialism now, at the end of the war, had significant representation inside the Allied cause. So, and by this I mean not just the kind of fairly empty rhetoric of so-called self-determination coming from Wilson, but also, more importantly, from the thousands of colonial soldiers whose participation in the conflict had been predicated on a renegotiation of their post-war political status. And of course, we should note that anti-imperialism had gained ground elsewhere as well, particularly in the Bolshevik sphere, where Lenin was making declarations of withdrawal, of Russia's withdrawal from imperial commitments, as a way of winning adherents to his cause globally. So, the question for these peacemakers, I use that term somewhat ironically, particularly Britain and France, who were absolutely determined to make their brutal 4 years pay dividends in the imperial realm, was how to reconcile this new anti-colonial feeling with their undiminished imperial ambitions. So, facing this difficulty, these political and diplomatic leaders of the so-called old great powers began envisioning a new kind of global order, one that would be comprised of self-consciously modern and theoretically sovereign states that would nevertheless remain under the continued economic and political authority of the old imperial powers. One way they did this was to declare that the post-war project of drawing new maps would reflect national interests, thus hopefully appeasing this kind of anti-imperial nationalist sentiment, while also, of course, conveniently reserving the right to construct new states in ways that would support their ongoing imperial ambitions. And partition represented a crucial piece of this imperially sponsored remaking of the global order along ethno-national lines. And it should be noted that this is one that could also encompass other modes of aligning national populations with political borders. All of the phenomena that we see emerging in this post-war period, population transfer, mass deportations, forcible denationalization, all accompanied by a political narrative of self-determination for national populations and protections for newly designated minorities, which is a new political word after 1919. So in other words, partition became a key strategy in this larger effort to code 19th century imperial practices as aspects of a new internationalism driven by humanitarian motives and liberationist sympathies. So we can note two major experiments in the years just after the First World War with this new idea that the forcible separation of ethno-religious communities could serve these imperial internationalist interests while also claiming to serve the interests of nationalist self-determination and sovereignty. The first occurred in Ireland, which is the first instance globally of partition in our terms. As had happened in other places as well, the First World War had created new conditions for Irish nationalism in the form of heightened demands from the British Centre for resources and men, alongside the kind of intensified international rhetoric that we hear in this period about the rights of small nations and the question of self-determination. So, 2 years into the war, the Irish Republican Brotherhood staged a military takeover in Dublin, the so-called Easter Rising of 1916, and declared the establishment of an Irish Republic, a move that brought, of course, a vigorous and violent response from the metropole. So in December of 1920, the Government of Ireland Act created separate Northern and Southern Irelands by setting up two different devolved parliaments, one in Belfast and one in Dublin. Initially, this failed to stop the violence, and as a possible solution to the deadlock, British policymakers increasingly began to advocate for some kind of dominion status that would grant Ireland a degree of autonomy, short of full independence, but keep it within the Commonwealth. So the following autumn, after a truce between the IRA and the British Army, the various sides came together to determine, quote, how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. And the resulting Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 led to the establishment of a separate Irish Free State the following year, although we should note that the thankless task of actually determining where the line on the map separating the new two Irelands would not be accomplished until after the Civil War came to a halt, not until 1925. The new Free State, which comprised 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland, was in fact not a free state. It was a dominion of the British Commonwealth of Nations, and it remained subordinate to the British Parliament until the eventual declaration of the Republic of Ireland in 1949. So we have this first experiment in partition as a strategy for at least partially retaining control over difficult areas. And at almost exactly the same time, we have the same thing happening at a more internationalist level, with the emerging League of Nations committing itself to the same principle of homogenous ethnic nation statehood to be accomplished with violence if necessary. The so-called Greek-Turkish population exchange, which I have argued elsewhere is a serious misnomer in terms of its euphemistic ring, was agreed on in 1923 between the new revolutionary Turkish government of Mustafa Kemal and the new revolutionary Greek administration. And under the auspices of the League of Nations and with financing from the League of Nations, it forcibly denationalized and expelled approximately 1.2 million Anatolian Greeks and 500,000 Muslim Turks under the aegis of this internationalist body, with the High Commissioner on Refugees, Fridtjof Nansen, supervising the proceedings. To the end of his life, Nansen continued to defend this act. He said, quote, "To unmix the populations of the Near East will tend to secure the true pacification of the region. And because the great powers believe an exchange of populations is the quickest and most efficacious way of dealing with the grave economic results which must result from the great movement of populations which has already occurred." This lionizing of the exchange as something that was a success has continued into the modern era. As recently as 1998, a lecturer at the Norwegian Academy of Arts and Letters lionized Nansen himself as having managed to excise a festering minority question, saying, "The mind boggles at the concept today of a Greek minority in Turkey and a Turkish one in Greece. How many lives would have been lost on that account?" Okay, so we'll put these images up to show you what this exchange looked like in practice, which of course involved many, many deaths, the loss of families, the loss of ties to land, the loss of property, and a sense of dislocation that has persisted to the present day. And of course, the exchange also served imperial interests by trying to put stable states in place with an interest in relations, ongoing relations with the great powers between Western Europe and the Bolshevik threat to the East. And we should also note that there was a money-making aspect to this, with bonds to support refugee resettlement floated as capitalist investment opportunities in places like New York, Chicago, and London, all the way through the 1930s. So I hope you're beginning to see the point that we're trying to make here. Partition originally did not emerge as a long-standing or natural solution to a problem of pluralism. It was a kind of imperial survival tactic, one that emerged in the context of a very particular post-World War I alignment of global interests that privileged ethnic nationalisms and ethnically purified nation states as the basic building blocks of the emerging world order. And this helps to explain why its imposition has, without exception, been accompanied by violence of the most extreme kind, because it was in fact never intended to provide some sort of solution to ethnic conflict, but rather was intended to smooth the path for imperial powers to create new forms of informal authority and friendly client states for a post-colonial era without regard to the human costs. And it's here that it's worth introducing one of the key conceptual approaches of the book, which is an idea that we have borrowed from Edward Said from one of his earlier books called The World, the Text, and the Critic, in which he posits the idea of something he calls a traveling theory, which is a way of explaining how ideas move across time and space. He identifies different stages in this process of idea transmission, a point of origin and a distances traversed, where an idea moves into a new place, and then a condition of acceptance, an implantation that makes the implantation of the idea possible, and then a final process by which he says, quote, "now full or partly accommodated or incorporated idea is to some extent transformed by its new uses." So we have an origin point and then a frame, which is the British Empire, through which this idea can be moved and taken into a new context. And then we have the inevitable process of a new local circumstance impacting the expression and the manifestation of that idea. So I'm going to pass off to Arie here to give us a sense of precisely how such a process of transmission and transmutation works, in this case from Ireland and Greece to Palestine, via the architect of the plan who first introduced what we now know as the quote-unquote two-state solution, which is not, as we'll see, some kind of natural remedy for an inescapable and inevitable clash, but rather the specific consequence of some specific personnel making use of ideas current in British imperial circles about other colonized and decolonizing regions within the empire.
Thank you. So as Laura alluded to, the notion of traveling theory that, again, we are borrowing from one of the lesser-known essays by Edward Said, is we are using it not coincidentally because we approach the study of partition as something that begs the answer how political theory is formed and how it moves across time and space. And sometimes ideas require idea carriers, and intellectuals and pundits in that respect play a very important role. And I will try to explain this and maybe take it down to a more specific test case that ties it more to the Israel-Palestine case, but shows how Israel-Palestine was always seen as part of a larger transnational and imperial setting by looking at this individual, Sir Reginald Copeland, a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, the second Bate Professor of Colonial History at that university, a long-standing contributor to a very influential magazine called The Round Table. He served also as its editor for so many years, which was a very influential at the time new imperial periodical. And if you would like, the case of Reginald Copeland is fascinating because he was involved, whether directly or indirectly, in almost all of the partitions that we will discuss. So, for instance, as a very young man, he worked closely with Lionel G. Curtis, the uncrowned leader of the Round Table group, and the mastermind behind the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. Yes, 1921, and you see here the date 1925, so it's not a mistake, as Laura alluded to it. What we will see in the Irish case almost will repeat itself in several cases. Partition will first be accepted as a principle. How to draw the line on the map will come next, and often as the last point. And in the case of the Irish Treaty, when Copeland was working as a protege of Lionel Curtis, who served as a special advisor to the Colonial Secretary of Affairs until October 1924, he had really a good chance to see it. And thanks to these contacts with the Round Table group, Copeland was able to see, albeit from a distance, the creation of the Irish Free State. Again, one of those euphemisms, a free state that was actually dominion under the British Crown, carving out and the carving out of a separate Northern Irish entity. Lo and behold, soon afterwards, in the summer of 1936, Copeland is appointed member of Lord Pill's famous Commission of Inquiry that he sent to Palestine to investigate the underlying causes of the Arab revolt and advising in 1937 the division of Palestine into two separate federal states for Jews and for Arabs. You can see the original map, and I would highlight the differences between the 1937 plan and the 1947 plan later on this graph. In this caricature from the Hebrew newspaper daily Davar, Copeland is here with his iconic kind of sardonic, ironic, if not snobbish look at the commission. We now know, thanks to scholarship, that he was basically the, if you would like, the alpha male in the group, very much driving the conclusions and pushing towards partition. And later on, in 1942, during World War II, Copeland made himself a leading expert in Indian politics, and he joined Sir Stafford Cripps on his famous special cabinet mission to India in March 1942, failing miserably to negotiate an agreement that would appease Muslim and Hindu nationalist leaders and keep an integrated Indian jewel in the crown. And as a good historian, he was a witness that automatically also wrote the first historical account of that famous mission, as you can see it on the slide before you. And it was around the same time that Copeland persuaded the newly founded Nuffield College at Oxford to fund a multi-volume study on the constitutional problems of India. Actually, the model of that book with its 3 volumes is almost parallel to the way the Peel Partition report appears, almost in structure. This is a famous trilogy that starts with historical survey, analysis of the present, and then a future advertising. So if you'd like, in that sense, Copeland served as the imperial Waldo, appearing time and again in all of these cases. He's a connecteur between these 3 partitions, traveling the world in search of adventure, blending within the crowd, just to make the reappearance time and again. Now, but Copeland was also, unapologetically, as you've heard, a mouthpiece of the interwar colonial elite. And it is here that I think we reach one of the crux of the arguments of the book, that we will disclose here, that while partitions, especially in the case of the Raj in India and mandatory Palestine, turned out to be, after World War I, into a quick and dirty exit strategy for an empire that is sinking fast, it actually emerged earlier in interwar years as, what you just heard, as a method of imperial containment, a strategy to keep the empire in an era of rising demand for self-government and anti-colonial sentiment. So if you'd like, you have here a very peculiar case in which you have to distinguish very sharply between original intentions and subsequent exercise and outcomes of these plans. And that took place, if you like, in radically different circumstances. And second, the case of Copeland shows you that as an imperial federalist thinker, he found partition attractive not as, if you like, a final solution, and pardon the connotations of the words, but this is the language of the sources, but as a temporary means to an end. And the end was seen in some sort of an imperial federalist setting. And lastly, through colonial thinkers like him that relied heavily on existing templates and precedents, you can see how similar methods of governance in distinct parts of the empire were copy-paste, but often it's not a simple technical procedure. It adapts and it changes, and hence I'm going back to Edward Said's notion that the fact that we have a clear origin point doesn't mean necessarily that the plan is maintained as a nucleus that is unchanging. There's a structure that appears. It changes, so as it's adapted to other areas. So I do not want to go into great detail and to offer a crash course on British imperial politics and federalist imperialism, but it is worth mentioning that the idea of partition in its earlier iterations in the interwar years was closely tied with the vision of rethinking how the empire would look like and rethinking and thinking about the British Empire as a new type of British Commonwealth of Nations, promoting dominion status, dominionization, and as a key strategy. And several key thinkers, and many of them historians very much associated with the Oxford School that Copeland was part of it, provided the language and provided the, if you'd like, intellectual ammunition to think about this new phase of imperial rearrangement, and especially thinking about the empire as a federal structure, a federal form of government that, if you would like, would allow the colonies and the overseas dominions a greater degree of self-government, but at the same time they are glued together and united under the crown, and in cases of war, as World War I, they would reunite to push away if you like, the barbarians. And in that respect, this is where the Irish case and or the Irish backyard, suddenly discussions about the Irish backyard appeared, and declaring Ireland independent de facto meant that it gained the status of a dominion. And I was amazed when presenting the book in a different context in the presence of students of Irish history in Ireland, that some of them forgot that Ireland started its career as a dominion and not as a free state in the way we imagine full sovereignty. And of course, it was following the trajectory of other cases in the empire, New Zealand, Australia, and most notably, of course, South Africa. And the Federalist political formula, much more than the drawing of the specific lines on the maps, which came only later, was, if you like, one of the key elements here, and it was very much anchored in the language of federation, of dominionization in that case. I would jump right on from here to the case of Palestine, because the application of the territorial partition in Ireland, it was often argued, provided a model of sorts for Palestine and later to India. Yet, it is true, but yet Ireland failed to serve as a viable precedent, at least in two critical senses. First, because while the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 granted dominion status for the 26 counties of the new free Irish state, the colonial administration in Palestine were reluctant to apply such a formula on the Yishuv, the Jewish population in pre-statehood Palestine, and the local Arab population, and to formally admit them into the British Commonwealth. Secondly, constrained by the League of Nations in Geneva and the Mandate Covenant, they had to come up with a different solution. They had a limited, if you'd like, maneuvering space that were not limited in the same way when thinking about the Irish case. Copeland, thus, needed to use a very impressive intellectual acrobatics when redefining even the term mandate in a way that would fit with his vision. And third, and most significantly, unlike Ireland, in Palestine, partition was not about geographical divisions alone. It was, if you like, a package deal. Because next to the idea of a territorial division, the drawing of a line on a map, the ideas of the new vocabulary concerning transfer of population and sovereignty were added into the package. So if you'd like, this is a crucial moment in the history of partition as a political idea, that it comes out as a package deal that consists of territorial division and a territorial division into two new entities that we call nation states, and re-engineering the geographical space so it will correspond with the demographic reality, and if it won't work, you will expel population and remove populations. So transfer is definitely part of that package deal as it emerges in Palestine. Now, there is no doubt that during the very short but dramatic and decisive period that Copeland stayed in Palestine, between November 1936 and January 1937, he forged a close dialogue with a representative of Jewish agency, and primarily with Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who was the senior among them. And much has been said about that meeting, about these type of negotiations. And this is a bad quality photo that summarizes a famous anecdote. It's a paparazzi. What you see in front of you is actually a paparazzi photo. In January 16, 1937, it was a rainy Sabbath. Chaim Weizmann invited Copeland to join him to visit Nahalal, the first Jewish moshav. It was a place where often the Zionist leaders would take VIPs to showcase the strength. And it was a rainy day, so Weizmann used the excuse to say, you know what, let's go into this room and discuss much. And it was a quote-unquote secret meeting that was caught in camera. Here you can see Weizmann pushing away one of the members of the moshav that tries to see what's going on here. And many would argue, including Professor Moti Golani, who contributed a chapter to our collection, that this is where you can see how often the Zionists would like partition to be seen, to be advocated as something that comes in a top-down fashion from the metropole, because it will make their case stronger rather as a Zionist initiative. True, but one of the reasons I replicated this photo has to do with something that is missing here. You can see Copeland, you can see Weizmann, you cannot see a map. The discussion, I mean, many historians said they would like to be the fly on the wall in that meeting room. What they were discussing was the idea of partition, the principle of partition, the exact carving out of the lines on the map was not the central thing they were discussing. Another surprising, and I will briefly mention it, pushback against partition came actually from the revisionist right leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who opposed partition in several pamphlets. One of them is reproduced before you, Al Chaluka. And as you may know, a hawkish militarist leader that believed in the greater land of Israel, it's not a surprise that he would push back against the partition plan. So of course the territorial division is one of the things that rubs him the wrong way. But if you read Jabotinsky's writings against partition more carefully, you will see another very interesting argument reproduced before you in my translation from one of his pamphlet. The chatter, it means here the chatter in the Peel Commission report, regarding the transfer of Arabs is even more irresponsible. From a Jewish point of view, it is nothing short of a crime. While the Royal Commission babbles on the instructive precedent, that is, the expulsion of more than 1 million Greeks from Turkey, we witness one of the cases in which it toys with concept that none of its members have any idea about. So it is a very surprising argument for those of us who are familiar with Jabotinsky. Again, a very hawkish right-wing, the founding father, if you'd like, the inspiration behind the Likud party. Why is opposing partition? One of the reasons, and it's hinted very well here, is the fact that Jabotinsky is still very much rooted in the interwar reality in which he knows that his base, to use today's words, are Polish Jews that are enjoying minority treatises. If you take and turn transfer of populations into a kosher means of redesigning politics, the consequences for the Jews in Europe would be disastrous. And as a young scholar named Gil Rubin showed not too long ago, surprisingly, in 1940, basically a short time before he died, Jabotinsky changed his mind, and suddenly, when the prospect of a mass immigration of Jews from Eastern and Central Europe into Palestine was deemed no longer relevant, suddenly transfer was okay, past the map. So part of what we see in the case of Palestine, which makes it so complicated, is the way in which the original plan of 1937 that was designed in interwar conditions and the way it was exercised in 1947 are radically different. And this, if you would like, it was, I won't go into detail, we can talk about it in the Q&A. Part of what makes the situation even more complicated is that it would be reintroduced after World War II already by the UNSCOP Commission, the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 1947, and this is already a partition that emerges in a different context of trying to find a way to move out from Palestine, when the empire and the imperial possessions were no longer seen as an asset, but actually a liability. It will be interesting to see that Copeland himself would try to, will launch a campaign to save the partition plan in that respect, and I won't go into detail. But to conclude, I would just want to take us to the other partition that was taking place at exactly the same moment, the partition of the Raj in India. So I've mentioned that during World War II, Copeland threw himself into the India question, and with Palestine now providing precedent, Copeland was surveying the landscape, the Indian landscape, more vigilantly. But in fact, he was searching, and that's a surprising finding, an alternative to partition in India. So if you have an assumption that partition is simply a simple copy-paste mechanism, actually this case proves you that it's slightly more complicated. But by the time Copeland was thinking about alternatives to India, for instance, as a good imperial federalist, he insisted that the idea of partitioning India is undoable due to the size, the demography, the composition of India, and what you need to come up with is some sort of a federal scheme. He called it the 7 regions scheme that would redesign the empire. But his suggestions now were completely ignored, and that is because ideas, and just like our children, we're bringing them to the world, but then they're moving and doing things by themselves, and there's no much control we can do about it. By this moment, partition was already an appealing idea and a vocabulary and a language that would be used against older federalist ideas, and that's part of the complicated post-World War II landscape. And it will be interesting to see that then the Zionists that enjoyed in a very remarkable short-term memory started looking at India in 1947 as a precedent that would affect them, forgetting that actually they themselves in 1937 were the origins of the idea that shaped the partition of India. And all this is tied very much to the way in which Copeland himself thought, and it's very interesting to have these talks at the time of Brexit, the way in which Copeland thought about Britain itself. So part of his imperial federalist vision was based on a bit kind of a self-complementary vision of what Britain stands for. A union of Scots, English, and Welsh, something that will be an alternative to ethnic nationalism of the continental model and the extra-European model. And it's not a surprise that his last book would be actually a book about Welsh and Irish nationalism. And so for him, Britain was the example of the success story of how to prevent partition. Again, it was very much coupled with some sort of federalist, almost eschatology about stages, and a hope that after partition one day, Jews and Arabs in Palestine will grow out of their enmity and form something bigger. So there's much more that we can discuss, but I would now like to leave time for questions, and thank you for your time.
Yes, so we have actually a decent amount of time for questions. But thank you guys so much for this really fascinating presentation. Should I pass the microphone around? Yeah. Yes, you want to pass the microphone over. Yeah. And if you can introduce yourself also.
Well, I don't need to introduce myself. I don't think it's on.
Oh. Well, it's for the recording, I guess.
Button disabled.
Oh, okay.
Well, maybe it's just
no need to use the mic,
Philippa
yeah.
Levine, I'm in the history department here. Thank you. That was fascinating. And I'm totally sold. I'm totally persuaded by the idea of the relationship between partition and a dying imperialism. But a couple of questions. I've always thought about partition in India as a panic measure, as something that's kind of done at the last minute because they really, everything's gone wrong. That wasn't their plan, as you two know so well, right? So it seems to me that there is a difference between the way partition is effected and what it means in the Indian context than in the others, in the sense that it was this essentially emergency measure, right? And so I'm wondering what difference that makes. And kind of coming on from that, why then is there never, given the relationship to anti-colonial nationalism, why then is there never partition in any part of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that is? So that, again, given the level of anti-colonial nationalism, it's kind of interesting to me that isn't happening. So that's one question or set of. The other one, you mentioned Brexit, and that was going through my mind, of course, the whole time, for fairly obvious reasons. Do you think that Brexit could end up, in a sense, with another kind of partition? I mean, a lot of us think that the union is going to break up as a result of Brexit. I mean, I think it seems highly likely to me that Ireland in particular is gone, possibly Scotland, Wales, who knows? It can't survive alone. But I'm wondering whether there are implications here for post-Brexit Britain, God help us all, and also for Europe, because it seems to me, because you made the point about the relationship between federalism and partition, and in a sense one can argue that the EU is a kind of neoliberal federal attempt to staunch certain kinds of nationalism, right? In those kinds of ways. I mean, what are the implications, perhaps, for Europe in the future, given that the Brexit deal is now done?
Wow. Want to
start?
take a stab? Yeah.
I'll start with the first question. These are really compelling and complicated questions. And I think that the question of the panicking aspect of partition in South Asia is an interesting one because it clearly is an element, a strong element, an important element in the negotiations. But I would say that the existence of the possibility of partition is there as a tactic that has been tried elsewhere, such that when we have the emergence of a situation of kind of decolonizing panic, it is something that is extant, that can be drawn upon, that has been used fairly recently, right? So I think that we do have, that this idea has been moving, and actually not just throughout the British Empire, but also in kind of more international bodies that are dominated by but not by Britain, like the League of Nations. You could make an argument that the population exchange between Greece and Turkey is also in some ways a response to the specific panic that is occurring as a consequence of the Turkish-Greek War, the burning of Smyrna, the mass evacuation/expulsion of Greeks from Anatolia, which happened before the exchange is actually formalized, right? So I think that part of what we're talking about is a kind of repertoire of imperial ideas and ideas about decolonization that are then there to be tapped, right? When the situation arises. And I would say that the reason this does not, so there are a couple of interesting things about the kind of post-1947-8 period where partition is formally, and particularly the idea of mass transfer, of forcible transfer, is formally taken off the table at the United Nations. They decide that they're not going to advocate for it. So it's a difference between the Peel Commission explicitly advocates for the forced removal of 300,000 Palestinian Arabs from the new Jewish state. By 1947, the UN is no longer willing to put that in the text of the partition resolution. So there has been a shift in kind of the public acknowledgement of that removal face of partition at the international level. Nevertheless, it of course continues to be operational in kind of less formalized ways, as we can see, for instance, by the Allied-supported expulsion of ethnic Germans from the Soviet realm and other examples. But I think that Africa, in the immediate aftermath of the war and in the aftermath of 1948, it's not a space where international authorities like the UN are particularly interested in constructing particular kinds of global regimes, right? And so that's why we don't see that happening until later. And then, of course, eventually, we do start to see proposals for partition in places like Sudan, particularly in the Middle East, but partition becomes a strategy where external powers have significant interests and where there are internationalist frames for making those interventions. So I think that's where it leads.
I'll add one more sentence because I agree completely. I mean, so I'll start actually with Brexit. I have no idea about the future, and I there's the Georgia Eliot quote that from all forms of human error, prophecy is the most avoidable one. But you can definitely, you see the echoes, and absolutely, there's something to be said about federalist structures that become very fragile in times of what we would call today populism, in the language of the interwar years, anti-colonial sentiment, and so on. I've one of the slides I passed through it very, very briefly. It's interesting to mention it in the context in having this conversation in the U.S. nowadays. One of the roundtable thinkers was actually very much interested in the U.S. and even wrote what was then a best-selling biography of Hamilton. So maybe we need to look more further into what Hamilton symbolized then for those roundtable thinkers. But I agree, sub-Saharan Africa being a different story has to do, of course, with also the civilizational yardstick that was used. That of course the entire mandate system assumes that there are areas that are more advanced and other that are not yet ready for self-governance. And because we see partition as kind of a very much creating then later on proxy states, if it's unlikely that you will create a proxy state that could be managed, why bother, right? So it's definitely, and of course it's tied with racial conceptions. One cannot ignore that. And the last comment was, of course, about part of the difficulty here is to how to bring into the picture both the metropolitan kind of top-down politics, but also still allow agency to the local actors. So there is wall in the head, to borrow that expression. I mean, local actors so when panic and a crisis unfolds, a partition is, the idea of dividing is not appearing out of nowhere. And then the panic, in the moments of crisis, you're executing something that was already there. Maybe because I'm an intellectual historian, I like thinking that ideas are first and then life imitates them. But that's a simplistic answer to your.
If you accept the premise of a Jewish state where a place where persecuted Jews are welcome, if you accept this premise, how does one retain that concept without partition? In other words, if you open up, this is one country and everybody votes, and obviously retaining the Jewish idea, a place where persecuted Jews are welcome, you could lose that through elections and all the other that sort of thing. This Jewish state, if you will, or a place where Jews are welcome, who are persecuted, is something that it's been many centuries, if ever, that has existed. And now that we have this, a place where Jews who are persecuted anywhere in the world can come and be accepted and welcome. How do you retain that without partition?
So I will thank you for your question. I think that your question very highlights one of the arguments actually we're making in the book. The language you're using is a classic post-1945 language that assumes that partition emerged in the context of what was then called the DP crisis, the displaced persons crisis, how to solve, how to kill two birds in one blow, both to have Jewish sovereignty and to solve the quote-unquote Palestine question and to solve a refugee crisis in Europe, in post-Holocaust Europe. But this is not the genealogy of partition. Partition was there as an idea way before that, and this is exactly one of the sharp differences between the original intentions and the exercise after 1945 that takes a very different gaze. I would also like to slightly kind of push back against the assumption that Jewish state is a preconceived notion that goes back to a millennia. The recent literature written by Israeli scholars who are scholars of Zionism would put a big question mark. And actually, an anecdote that is very telling in that respect. We'll go back to Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Organization. Until 1937, until the first partition plan, he famously avoids using the word state. One of his closest aides would say, to utter the term state in the presence of Weizmann, it's like uttering the explicit name of God in a synagogue. You're not doing this. Now, the older Zionist historiography will say, but of course he thought about state, it was simply tactical, so he was not using the word. The recent literature will say, no. Many of the Jewish nationalists, the Zionists, were thinking about themselves as a minority nationalist group. And the political model that we call a nation state, that hyphenated creature that we call nation state, they can be nationalists. Don't misunderstand me. They are Jewish nationalists. But they see nation state as a model that would disadvantage Jews exactly in the context of the fear from a tyranny of the majority. Why should we think about our future in a place in that sense. And interwar period Zionism is all about an wide array of other alternative solutions that only we, the historians, are interested in, but I think will become very relevant today, about how to think about autonomy, how to think about a cantonization program. Yes, the Brit-Chalong thinkers were thinking about Switzerland as a model, how to create some sort of a federalist arrangement. Partition and the creation of a nation state after 1945 kind of flushes all this down the toilet. But if you're thinking about how politicians and thinkers are now thinking about the future of the region, surprise, surprise, they are uttering, suddenly falling back on a vocabulary that anyone who reads the Zionist sources from the interwar years would see, no, that rings a bell, that's very similar. And this is why I think it sounds very braggy. We need historians in the room.
I think, too, I would add just very quickly that if we have naturalized the idea of partition as something that is kind of an inevitable solution, we have done that to an even greater extent with the concept of nation statehood writ large, which is a 20th century invention, right? We don't have nation states really in their current form prior to the First World War. The construction of the idea of a global world order made up of kind of, hermetically sealed ethnic nationalisms is a post-1919 phenomenon, and there's nothing inevitable about its emergence or its acceptance. And I think that one of the things that's so interesting about this interwar period is that it's a period where people actually are thinking about alternatives, right? Thinking about other forms of political organization. And it's worth dwelling on that moment, particularly as we now see the toxic effects of the kinds of nationalism that were put into place.
But the Judaism is somewhat, because of anti-Semitism and the history of it for centuries and centuries, if you will, perhaps the Jewish situation is somewhat unique and different than the other ones that you have discussed. And because historically the anti-Semitism certainly throughout the Europe has been a way of life, there are times when if you could pick up the persecuted Jew and move him to a place where he's safe, it's a different situation. I mean, it's a little bit different than Pakistan and India and some of these other places because of the incidence of anti-Semitism and the history thereof.
We can talk about it later on. I see other students that would like to ask questions.
I think that maybe some folks in the back might want to ask a question.
Yeah. You guys actually touched on this in response to that question, and sort of refashioning the question a little bit. If we assume that nations or groups of people, however we define them, in some form should have autonomy, right? So the idea of nationalism in some form is that a nation has a space where it can engage in developing its own culture or in reinforcing its own security or whatever the goal of establishing a nation is. And if we assume, right, which we don't have to, but if we assume that that's a good thing, that it's good for communities to be able to have some degree of autonomy in order and ensure their own security and whatever else comes with that. You mentioned alternatives. You mentioned a little bit the idea of Switzerland and a few other things. I'm curious if there have been other alternatives that have been developed recently, other ideas of autonomy that have been developed recently that are more adapted to the current world that we live in the 21st century that are interesting to you that you might want to mention.
Well, I think that there are clearly ideas about binationalism that are having a moment right now that are being discussed. I think that, I mean, as historians, I think it's worth thinking back on other iterations of political authority that we do have in practice. For instance, thinking about the kinds of political arrangements that inhere in the late Ottoman Empire, in the late Habsburg Empire, these kinds of, which I mean, I'm not holding these up as examples of the perfect kind of political arrangement, but I do think it's worth thinking about ways of accessing power through channels other than nation statehood, right? And that, all of these multinational pluralistic empires had modes of managing communal difference and communal autonomy that in many ways represented goals for the interwar period. I mean, we can absolutely see this, for instance, in kind of the various iterations of regional and Arab nationalism in Palestine and Syria and Iraq during the interwar period, that people were looking back to the Ottoman model and thinking about how Ottomanism worked as a pluralistic empire that also involved electoral systems and representation and assemblies, in ways that recognized communal difference, did not seek to erase communal difference, but and acknowledged them explicitly within the kind of political system. And so there is, I mean, it's interesting because there is almost a kind of wave of nostalgia for some of those arrangements, which is deeply ironic in certain respects, right? But we do see that in some of the anti-colonial movements that emerge, from Egypt to Iraq in the 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s. And something similar is happening in Europe, actually. I mean, I think there is also there are memories of power-sharing arrangements in Austria-Hungary, for instance, right, that survive into some of the kind of reimaginings of political authority.
That serve as a model.
That serve as a model, exactly.
So many would argue that, I mean, among Zionists especially, Central European Zionists, they are looking, I mean, to begin with, Malachia Cohen has a book named Jacob and Esau, talking about trying to offer a very kind of a Plato to NATO history of Jews and empires. But to make a bold statement, historically Jews were very much used to live in empires, and that was kind of the default way of finding ways of forging types of alliances and pockets and channels of power sharing. Specifically in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Habsburg model was extremely important for them. It's amazing how many Jewish nationalists were reading Karl Renner, including Jabotinsky, including so both people that we would associate today as the fathers of the Israeli right, and those that were seen as vegetarian, tree-hugging, loving pacifists of Brit Shalom. They were reading Karl Renner, that was thinking about a model that he was not using this language we would call some sort of a multinational, thinking about the empire as a multinational state that would allow levels of autonomy within a bigger shared kind of a structure. And that was a source of inspiration, and you definitely see some movements. Sometimes these are grassroots movements. I mean, if you want to take it to politics and present, so groups like Eretz Acheret in Israel today, Israel Palestine today, are thinking in similar lines. I mean, the historical echoes are phenomenal, and they're thinking about some sort of a confederal rearrangement that is not going back to the two-state solution that assumes a division, and assuming that you need to come up with some sort of a power-sharing mechanism in the space between River Jordan and the Mediterranean. Whether they like it or not, they are not reinventing the wheel. Yeah.
I too really enjoyed this genealogy and comparison, and I'm pretty convinced by this argument about this partition as kind of a last throw of imperialism, a way to save it. But it's interesting that we're now talking about the Ottomans and the Habsburgs as a more inclusive, potentially, model, because as you guys were presenting, I was thinking about how these population transfers of Greeks and Turks that we're now smirking at as successful didn't occur in a vacuum. So there were mass transfers of Muslims out of the lands taken from the Ottomans by the Habsburgs. There were mass transfers of Muslims from the Russian Empire to the Ottoman Empire, and there were supposed to be transfers of Christians the other way. That didn't really happen. And there was the Armenian genocide short before these transfers. So I guess maybe these bolster the idea of this as an imperial survival, but I'm not sure they bolster the idea of it as uniquely 20th century phenomenon, at least not the population transfer part of the package you're talking about. So how do you guys read those in this
I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, I agree with your genealogy, taking it back to the late 19th century in certain respects. And the idea of population transfer certainly has its roots. And I would argue some of the ideas of ethnic cleansing and genocide that manifest themselves in the Armenian genocide during the war have their origins in those expulsions, mostly but not entirely, of Muslims from the Balkans from the 1870s forward. I would argue that that moment, that late 19th century moment, is a moment where we begin to see some of the effects of conversations and enforcements of ethnic nationalisms in failing imperial spaces, right? So we have this longer history of the replacement of empire with nation statehood. And that actually it's a process. We don't write about this here particularly, but I have written about it elsewhere in talking about this process as one where violence on the ground creates ethnic nationalism rather than the other way around, right? So that we have these late imperial politics that result in particular kinds of local struggles that are defined as they are unfolding, and even sometimes after the fact, as nationalist struggles, right? So I think we do have this longer period where the empires are disintegrating, where these kinds of older forms of communal coexistence, which are kind of fundamentally not representative, right, in meaningful ways, are being replaced by a politics of ethno-national separatism that is inherently violent, right? So I think that process is instructive, and that one of the things it tells us is that this process of creating the nation state requires physical brutality, right? And that's one of the things to note about partition as a so-called kind of solution, that as that emerges as a tool of the European empires, as it emerges as a tool of decolonization, as it eventually emerges as a tool of internationalist authority in the form of the UN and other agencies, that history of its entanglement with violence has been overlooked and lost, right? And I think that's part of what we're trying to suggest here. So I would agree that there are kind of longer term, there are always antecedents there, and there is a longer term history, particularly of the idea of removal and population transfer, so to speak, and exchange, and all of these euphemisms that we use. But that it is necessarily bound up with this transition from empire to nation state, right? And that we can think of that in kind of ever broader frames as a history that revolves around the moment of 1919, but extends to some degree in both directions.
I think your question is fabulous, because you put your finger on a critical point here. I mean, so when to use I use the metaphor of a package deal. So I agree with you completely that it will be wrong to talk about forced displacement of communities as a novel 20th century arrangement, something that came out of partition. Took this as one of its elements, and of course it has earlier echoes. What is interesting about the way it was worked out in the interwar years as part of partition plans has to do with the existence of a new type of international order and legal system that, and to use the Umutuzuz term, you're formalizing displacement. So expulsions were taking place, but now you have the League of Nations saying, here's a kosher stamp, that's a legal and a good way, we can have a treaty. And we can agree on that, and we can even, and that sounds so odd to us today, a liberal solution to differences. And the second point has to do with the word differences. I think that part of what is happening here is, of course, that the differences are being nationalized. And the groups are no longer seen as religious confessional groups that cannot be coexisting. These differences are being nationalized, and you're thinking about, so you automatically take anyone who's Christian, you call him Greek. You automatically take anyone who's a Muslim, you call him Turk. That's part of what is going on here, which is a very interesting, and this is where the British thinkers, this is where I think they could not. This is not the Irish case. This is where you add the Irish case to what's happening in in the Near East, and this is and then they come to Palestine with this kind of already mixed bag of ideas. You wanted to ask something? Yes.
So this might require some prophecy on your part, but could you speak to partition in terms of the United States, both in internal, like current sort of relationships to each other as Americans, and also our territories, be it Guam or Puerto Rico?
It's an interesting idea. We've had, when we have given this talk in other spaces, sometimes the question of Canada comes up and the question of Quebec, right? I think that, so I would make a distinction between kind of secessionist impulses, which is of course something that American history has seen, and partition, which requires kind of an external authority of some sort, right? That said, so I think that there are relationships between those two phenomena, but they are not quite the same thing, right? So I think that when we think about partition, part of the phenomenon is the existence of some sort of authority, external authority that is making decisions about, the concept of partition itself, is able to enforce those decisions, is drawing borders eventually, maybe, right? And I'm not sure that we have quite the same history of that in the American framework. That being said, it is interesting to think about all of the ways in which the kind of divergent political rights of American holdings are reflective of a longer history of European-style empire, dating much further back than we usually recognize. So there are some consonances there that I think are interesting to think about and to explore.
Yeah. I've nothing to add to that. Maybe when I'll gain my American citizenship, I'll be more open to that. Yeah, James.
Something that we talked about in one of my classes is like restitution. And so thinking about like the forceful transfer of like mass populations within partition, are there efforts in like post-partition time to restitute for like lost property or possessions?
It is a very interesting question. There have been efforts. I would say by and large they have been radically unsuccessful. The League of Nations, so to go back to some of our earlier examples, for instance, the League of Nations did have a kind of partially worked out plan to recompense people for property lost in the exchange. It's worth noting that in that context, Christians were to be repaid at much higher rates than Muslims. So there was a kind of inequality built even into the idea of restitution. But it really didn't come to fruition for anybody in any real way. So, and I think that's been typical, that that's an issue that comes up in theory, but is rarely undertaken in practice. I can't think of any examples where we've had real.
It's not restitution in that sense, but a legal mechanism that will try to find. So part of what is a very interesting but also complicated when you put India-Pakistan next to Israel-Palestine is that while in India-Pakistan, at the end of the day, you do have two states, and you created mechanisms that tried as much as you can with an army of bureaucrats to create some sort of quid pro quo, that a refugee that lost a home and property in one place will get into the house of someone who was just expelled. So the legal mechanisms that require creating a general some sort of an agency that will see what is the lost property and then assign it, and it's often real estate, but sometimes it's also other types of property, books, for instance. You do have this. It was one of those things that I've stumbled upon in my research, and that the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passed a law and thinking about how to formalize this. And surprise, surprise, the model was Pakistan. But here exactly is the problem. You do not have a reciprocity with another Palestinian state on the other side of the border. So, and if you like, the story of there's a small anecdote about the story of the nucleus of the collection of very important Arabic books at the Israeli National Library that came from Sakakini's house. So they were marked AP, AP, abandoned property. The assumption, they were put aside. The assumption was that one day partition will take place, there will be an agency, and they will be given back to their legal owner. Years pass, you start putting them in the general stacks. Years pass, that's it, right? So you had these kind of, bureaucrats definitely thought in these terms, but they never, but even, agencies like Apotropos Nechsei Nifkadim, which is, I'm blacking out on the English translation, which is kind of the agency that was recording the houses that were abandoned by the Palestinians. This is a mechanism that was copycat, it's really a copy-paste from the Pakistani case.
It's probably worth noting, too, that this is one of the most common and kind of under-recognized experiences of refugee resettlement in many, many places across the 20th century is to be put in somebody else's house, right? And that happens in South Asia, it happens in Israel, Palestine, it happens in the Armenian cases, right, where people were moved into abandoned, I use that term very much in quotes, properties. And, it has been a feature of the making of the nation state through these kind of forcible measures throughout the 20th century in many, many, many places. And it's something that I think as historians we haven't really emphasized enough. There's a materiality to these exchanges that is important to acknowledge.
Can I add something to that, which is that actually there is a really interesting case in the Indo-Pakistan, in the South Asian context of human property. So what happens is with women who find themselves in the wrong place, so Muslim women in India and Hindu women in Pakistan who got stuck, there's actually an agency that gets set up, I think at the end of 47, maybe 48, which is trying to sort of think about whether those women should be returned as property, especially if they're pregnant, to their original families, or whether they should be persuaded to stay with the person who made them pregnant, who is going to be of the other. I mean, there's a whole...
But stay and convert?
Yes, but it's very much the notion of women as property, particularly if they're women who have been raped or have become pregnant in some way. And I don't know whether that translates into any of the other cases of partition, but it becomes this huge mess. From about 48 onwards, for about 4 years, and there's an agency that deals with it. They have a fairly large population of social workers, and the women's lives are just a complete mess, as you can imagine. But it's very, very common, and they're definitely being seen as property, as family property, as the property of husbands. And of course, there's the very common thing of women actually being given little poison things to wear around their necks, so that if the other group comes in, rather than risk being raped and pillaged, you poison yourself or throw yourself down a well. And I mean, it's been pretty well documented. And I don't know what's happening in any of those places, but it's a kind of human property issue that I think is a kind of restitution in a way, but in a really sick way.
Yeah. It's almost, that's really interesting. It's almost, there's a conversation within the historiography of the Armenian genocide about survivors who were absorbed, so mainly women and children, right, on the marches through the Syrian desert, who were absorbed in some way, whether voluntarily or forcibly, into Muslim families along the trails, and whether that is a kind of rescue, as some have suggested, or whether it represents a kind of further depredation, right? So perhaps that's an interesting kind of semi-parallel case, yeah.
If I can just take my prerogative to ask one final question. It's actually two questions. I don't like doing that, but I'll do it. I was really struck by one of the slides that you had describing the three cases of Ireland, Israel and Palestine, and India and Pakistan with this kind of circle. Right, but the arrow comes all the way back to Ireland. So I'm not sure whether or not this is something that you were intending in terms of the imagery there, but to what extent, especially as we think about Brexit and the possibility of Scottish independence, et cetera, the repartitioning of Ireland, so to speak, as the UK exits from the European Union, that we essentially see these kinds of colonial policies come home to roost. In the same way that we can talk about colonial policies in terms of genocide coming home to roost in terms of 20th century Europe, is that a correct assessment here? And how has it changed, right? From say the 1920s up until the present in this respect?
I think the arrow does go all the way around, right? I mean, one of the explicit kind of arguments in our book is that partition is not a dead, closed process, right? That it is ongoing, that conversations about it are ongoing, that questions about its role in the making of the kind of modern state order are ongoing, and that the question has just been reopened once again, not in the Irish case particularly, right? This question about what role should partition play in the making of this kind of, post-Brexit UK and the post-Brexit Europe. So I think that, it's still an open question. It is a question at the international level. It's a question at the national level. What are viable forms of political authority in this constantly decolonizing era? And I think actually in this respect, it relates to a much broader conversation about decolonization as also an ongoing process. It's not something that happened and is now over, but as something that continues to affect the making of spaces that are both metropolitan and colonial / post-colonial. So yes, I think the arrow does, it is a circular phenomenon. Mm-hmm.
Those are excellent final words. I don't have.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.